So in that last panel, we spent a lot of time talking about wages. In this panel, we are going to talk about one of my favorite topics ever, wealth, specifically black wealth. And as a reporter, this issue came up a lot because I think, one, a lot of people don't understand wealth, how it's accumulated, how it's passed down, what its importance is. And people don't actually understand kind of the massive gap that exists between black families and white families, how it came to be, and if there's any hope of narrowing it. Andre, I want to start with you. Can you talk a little bit about the scope broadly of where we are when it comes to the black wealth gap and how that plays out in Memphis?
Yeah, first I wanted to just preface my comments with first to say thanks for having me. Hello, Memphis. But I typically preface my comments by stating there's nothing wrong with black people that ending racism can't solve. that so much of our conversation about wealth and income resorts to things like increasing wages when we know that an increase in wages will not close a wealth gap. That the wealth gap that predicts that black and brown people will have zero net wealth by 2050 was created by federal policy. Mm-hmm. The more we talk about increasing wages and these other aspects, which are important, I want people to eat. Yes. But let's not get it twisted. The way we gave wealth to white people, we can give wealth to black people primarily through housing policy, business policies, and other significant things. My studies, one of my most significant studies around housing. And we did a study where we looked at homes where the share of the black population was 50% or higher versus homes in places where the share was less than 1%. And what we found after an apples-to-apple comparison, we control for education, we control for crime, we control for all those Zillow metrics like walkability and all those different things, fancy terms that we use. And what we found that homes in majority black places are worth 23% less, and that's also true in the nation as it is in Memphis. And nationally, homes are devalued by $48,000 per home, accumulatively $156 billion of lost equity, simply because black people live around the home. Now, I want to put this into context. That would have paid for, that $156 billion in lost assets would have paid for about 4 million black-owned businesses, given the average startup cost for black-owned businesses. It would have financed 8 million four-year college degrees. It would have replaced the pipes in Flint 3,000 times over. It would have paid for all of the damage in Hurricane Katrina. You know, and by the way, the homes in Memphis metros in black neighborhoods are worth about $24,000 less. Robbing school districts, robbing police systems, robbing communities, not allowing people to weather the shocks that will inevitably come from economic crises. So I just wanted to say that we are not going to create black wealth without a serious conversation on federal policy, bringing money directly to somehow homeowners, black folk in these places that have been historically devalued over time.
Yeah, absolutely. So we started on housing, but another thing that you mentioned and another huge engine of wealth creation for people is business ownership and the ability to participate in that, to pass it down, to thrive. Mark, I want you to talk a little bit about what the circumstances are for black business owners in Memphis and how it plays into the existing wealth gap.
Well, absolutely. Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you for having me. So with respect to black businesses, so my role is the Chief Visionary Officer for the Black Business Association of Memphis. And in terms of that, I've been described, not by myself, as a curatorial visionary. So what does that mean? For me, it means the ability to synthesize the two languages that I speak fluently, the first of which is standard English. I think I can speak. And the second of which is the language of finance. And so when we talk about finance, we look at capitalism, and we are in a capitalistic society. And so if you look over my right shoulder, you'll see all these freighters coming in from Federal Express, and how that is capitalism. And it speaks to one thing, and that's EPS, earnings per share. And so how are black businesses able to engender that concept? And that's what we work on in terms of, let's focus on aggregation of capital and investing in businesses, enterprises, as you said, Andre. You have capital that needs to be deployed into businesses and matching up that supply and demand curve. It's really simple. The questions are complicated, but the solutions are simple. So it's how do we activate that, and then you throw in the schism of racism. And so what racism means for me is that when I speak to somebody and they can't understand what I'm saying, that is a frustration, and I try not to be frustrated about it. But for black businesses, as Dr. De La Vega just told you, the statistics are dire. And so we don't want to do that. We want to talk about solutions, and how do we focus on solutions, and really with alacrity making every effort that we need to make to invest in businesses. In my history, I've seen bad deals and I've seen good deals, but it's all about how do you activate deals. So,
Anika, these are questions that you've been thinking about a ton in Detroit and working
Yeah.
on. What have you learned, and what might be applicable outside of Detroit?
So we just released a new report on Detroit's African American middle class as an opportunity for a prosperous Detroit. So what is the value proposition of wealth and African American wealth in Detroit? And one of the reasons that we wanted to focus on that specifically is because what we know right now is that 75% of Detroiters are living off of $50,000 or less, right, in terms of their household income. We also know that white businesses are 3 times as likely to grow their businesses than African American businesses, and more than Latino businesses in Detroit. And that's regardless of what kind of business that is. So that's another problem. And then we also know that home ownership in Detroit has decreased dramatically. And so these are the sort of the fundamental wealth factors. We also have a 14% educational attainment rate. And with that educational attainment rate, you are likely to make 25% less with the same bachelor's degree than your suburban counterpart in Metro Detroit. Now, I would, without knowing all of the statistics here in Memphis, I would be willing to believe that they're probably not that much different. Mm-hmm. And I think asking the right questions as a local community has to be really important, and starting with your asset. It doesn't always have to start with what are all of your liabilities as a community. We really also wanted to start with the number of African American neighborhoods in Detroit, because we felt like that is the strongest place for us to start in Detroit. So in Detroit, there are 11 African American neighborhoods, and we describe those as 50% or more African American and 50% or more middle class or higher. Okay? Now for Detroit, that's sort of a lower bar because of the general income level, but we felt like that's a good threshold for us to start with. In Memphis, we know you have 5. Now, I don't know where those are. You probably, those that are from Memphis know your own neighborhoods. You have 5 that are also considered 50% African American, 50% middle class. So what's happening in those neighborhoods? What is that home ownership rate like? What are the small businesses there? Do those families work in Memphis, or are they having to drive an hour and a half to get to work every day? Those are the things that make middle-class families much more vulnerable and fragile. And how we're trying to focus on that in Detroit is by dealing with these particular sort of fissures in middle-class communities where we can actually grow our middle class and stabilize the middle-class families that are there, and then attract other families that can come into Detroit.
Can I just
Yeah.
add on it? When we talk about the middle class, we're generally, particularly in this context, we generally talk about earnings. But wealth is determined by assets minus debts. You can easily argue, there is no black middle class. When during the recession in Detroit and elsewhere, when housing market bottomed out, it eliminated black wealth, almost eliminated, because 50% of our wealth is tied up in the homes. And so we do need to have a serious conversation about diversifying how we grow wealth. But I just want to challenge something I heard, I may have misheard it, about this notion that in capitalism doesn't hoard wealth. Oh, yes, it does.
That is capitalism.
Yes, it does. I mean, racism is used to make white people money. I talk about assets in majority black places. I never forget our relationship to the concept of asset is ownership. We were owned to make white people money, to establish laws that make white people money. I mean, I lived in New Orleans, Louisiana. This prison system not only robbed people from opportunities, it made white, smaller communities money. We hoard resources. It's not because of a lack of talent. We don't deploy revenues to people who deserve it. And so what's frustrating with me, and you can probably sense it, is that, I'm not waiting, and you can ask my colleagues at Brookings, I'm not waiting for industries to cluster and
Where are you on reparations?
Yeah.
One of my projects, I have to figure out how to use this devaluation metric to deploy tax credits or some kind of other mechanism to make sure people get the resources that other people have gotten over time. And so this conversation about, wealth building, whites build wealth not because of talent. It's because of the muckety-mucks in your city hoarding wealth for themselves. It may not be at a individual, I'm not hoarding wealth but you're hoarding wealth for your colleagues.
Yeah.
There is a cultural component to business that is predicated on disarming black people. And we got to acknowledge that.
Mark, you're our Memphis person. I want you to weigh in here. Does this?
I want him to have a job, though.
We talked about this. We talked about this before I came up.
Does
Because
any
I got to
of
work
you
with all these
resonate?
people after y'all leave and go back to Detroit and DC or wherever you are. So, and I know these people. So, no, and let me be objective, and please respect my objectivity. Before I walked up here, my wife sent me a text, and she sent me a scripture. So Pastor Hutchison, what she sent me was Proverbs, I think it's 20:22, train up a child in the way, and that child will, when he grows up. Essentially, what she's saying to me is, hey, you need to talk about, it's about educating people, and let's have, you said a conversation, but we need to be having more than conversations. There needs to be a strategy and tactics and a design to how do we look at the structures of where we are to advance. And what does advancement look like? What is it? Let's define on milestones. But let's kind of come back just a little bit. Memphis is such a unique place. I've lived here off and on for approximately 52 years. And we come in fits and starts. We start things and we have these elegant plans and these names and we lay things out, and just like other communities, of course. But I think we're actually probably more adroit at doing it. We're just good at it, at naming stuff. And so now we need to get beyond that and really just go deeper, and it's a deeper dive into what are results going to be? What does it mean? I mean, if you look out, I spent time in Nashville. They talk about the cranes and how much development and growth. If we look out this window, there's not a crane that you can see out there in terms of development and what's happening right now. That's going back to when I spent my time there in '96, and now it's transformed into the hottest community 200 miles east of here. We don't have envy, but we do use that as a metric. We were talking about DC, or somebody was talking about DC early in Howard University. That is phenomenal, what is going on around there. But how do we, as African Americans, participate in that? What are the things that we do? Let's just look at the fundamentals, the bricks that built that, and replicate it. We don't have to, I mean, yeah, you can disrupt. Disruption is great, I suppose, but we need to figure it out.
I think that there has to be, as a city that's also growing, Detroit is growing at a really rapid rate. And I think for us, and growing economically, not necessarily, I mean, the decline is starting to slow, but for us, there has to be, and the conversation that we're trying to have in Detroit right now is about intentionality. And if, in fact, you're going to be an investor in Detroit's growth and opportunity, you have to recognize that Detroit is 78% African American, and that African Americans should be working not on the temporary low-wage jobs, but they have as much of an opportunity to take advantage of the new sectors that are coming into Detroit, that are investing in Detroit, that are looking at venture opportunities, that we're being intentional about investing in African-American businesses and other sectors. And in all of the different sectors, so eds and meds, be intentional about that. You're not opening a new heart wing at the Henry Ford Hospital unless we know that there's some intentional opportunity for investment at all levels, for the small business owner, all the way up to new physicians that are coming to Detroit or existing physicians that have an opportunity to work in Detroit. So how being able to talk about that intentionality in your own city without any hesitation, that this is what we're doing. We need for our city to grow. And Detroit can't grow, the region can't grow, Michigan can't grow unless Detroit is successful. And that means those 78% of Detroiters that are living there right now have to also be successful and participant in that growth. And so I don't see how that's different. Maybe, I'm from Detroit, I'm from up north, it's different up there. Maybe, but it's still, the situation doesn't change if you actually want the situation to change. And if, in fact, you have to think about a different opportunity, like the collection of assets and wealth locally in your own community. There is some wealth here. We know that in Memphis. Your numbers actually look better than in Detroit, quite frankly. Even although Detroit City is a larger city, your poverty is less, and your education attainment is higher, your workforce outcomes are higher. How you actually dig into those numbers to make sure that Memphis and African American residents in Memphis are actually prospering, I think is the next question.
I actually want to come right back to that and have Mark and Andre weigh in. I do want to let the audience know we're going to come to you for questions in just about 2 minutes. If you can start thinking about them now, whittle them on down, make sure it is a question and not a comment. I would super appreciate it. There'll be mic runners on either end. So, we mentioned Howard, and in Shaw, there's a ton of development happening, but, even in the past 2 weeks, there have been conversations about how nasty, quite frankly, that gentrification looks. people walking around on Howard's campus and being disrespectful of the institution and the students there, shutting down music at the Metro PCS, which quite frankly was a nice corner for me. Like, there are problems when investment comes in, and Anika was just getting at this. How do we think through if there are cranes everywhere and Memphis is developing the way that will help it economically, that it doesn't benefit one segment of Memphis and not the other?
Yeah, very quickly. If you look over at Lemoyne Gardens and Lemoyne Owen College, it's going to happen there. It's just a matter of time. So you look at what's happening in D.C. and Nashville and other places around the country, and then you say, okay, we don't want that to happen because that's not good, the way it's happening. And we devise public policies that and think through it on how do we avert that. That is just to be very quick about it and clear about it.
But you don't, this is the thing. When you invest in place and not people, you get gentrification.
Yeah.
You know, in D.C., now right next door to the Mecca, Howard University, where talent is brimming, we invest in outsiders and people who will take enormous risk on and put money in their hands. You know, when we talk about the development of D.C., it's really the development of white people in D.C. And so, and this is what happens. Because black people are devalued, they want to get rid of every kind of residual of blackness in an area. And so, if you're not familiar with the Shaw neighborhood in D.C., it was a majority black place. D.C. was 78% black. Going through the 70s, it really wasn't until 2000 where you saw a precipitous drop from 60 to 50%. But right now, when white folks move in and they hear the go-go, and they see the mambo sauce on the next to the salt and pepper, and they're like, "What is this? What is this? I don't know what this is. Oh, it's black. Let's get rid of it." And what's fascinating, the reason why you go to places like Memphis, D.C., Detroit, Baltimore, is because of black people. Everything great about New Orleans was created by black people. Everything great about Memphis, black. And so my point is there has to be a way for you to build upon that asset of blackness. There has to, it can be used to construct communities, to build themes, to build character, instead of sanitizing it as a way to make money. And so I'm glad you brought up the DC thing, because right now we're not kidding. A person walked their dog on the campus to allow it to take a dump on the campus, and the person had the audacity to come out of his mouth, "Well, if you don't like people walking on your campus, move the campus." The campus that was created in the aftermath of slavery. I mean, this is insane, this notion that people can own a city. But we do want to live together. There's no question. We're all in this together. And we have got to create practices and policies to reflect that reality.
All right, if we have a couple questions, we can take them very quickly.
You can give that an applause.
One right back there.
My name is William Edwards, and basically just to piggyback on what you said, and then I do have a question.
Let's make the first part quick and then the question.
Okay. Short version, condensed version. 1619, first slave ships came here. Okay. And we've only been forced to be a part of the equation since 68. So that's over 440 years of not being a part of the equation or the conversation. My question to you is, based on all the wealth, the Ivy League schools, the financial institutions, all the wealth was built on the backs of slavery. How do we, based on what you said, since the narrative now is, since technology is moving forward, in slavery we focused on skilled and unskilled labor positions. Even still today in 2019, the majority of blacks still occupy positions in skilled and unskilled labor positions. So with the thing of we don't need you anymore and we don't want you anymore, how do we as a community, a black community, overcome that?
But you're sitting in, remember, you're sitting in a place that is dedicated to the mobilization of people.
Right.
In a nutshell, if we don't organize and put pressure on the so-called market, I don't see things happening.
Yeah.
It's the
You know,
market.
so it's about us mobilizing, organizing, and leveraging our assets in ways that demands change in all of these systems.
I think we have another question right here.
Noel Hutchinson and Brother Yates, thank you for the unsolicited shout out. Kind of piggybacking on his question, didn't know he was going to ask it in that way, but let me frame it this way. We've had conversations so far talking about the dichotomy of what the government has done, what laws have done, and what we perhaps need to do for ourselves. So kind of share with us some solutions. How do we deal with that tension? How do we deal with government? How do we deal with our part in this equation? Because while we wrestle with this, Rome is burning, and we're the ones that have to deal with it.
Can I jump in there?
Absolutely.
So one of the things that we learned by focusing on the middle class in Detroit was the number of African Americans that have moved out of Detroit, right? And that this was actually a trend, that you'd get to a certain income level, you would move to the suburbs. And what we're actually finding in Detroit right now is that the only neighborhoods that are growing, the middle class neighborhoods are growing, they're growing white. So that's who's moving into the middle class neighborhoods, while African Americans are still the largest numbers to move out. That's not a government, nobody's getting a check and moving out. They're making a conscious decision to move to other communities outside of Detroit. And that's a decision that you can actually make. How do we actually make our neighborhoods, build our wealth in the neighborhoods that are already stable and growing and are already majority black right now? So how you actually make investments in your own community, that's like, haven't we been talking about this for 100 years? Buy black, this is what you should be doing. We still need that same premise in our own neighborhoods, and we need to do it with the data so that people understand that.
And that's why, and I will direct answer your question, I have a book coming out in 2020, Know Your Price, that you can buy for pre-sale at Amazon.com. But no, the premise of the book, that's right. But the premise of the book is based on this play, my favorite play by August Wilson, Two Trains Running. The main character, Memphis, is about to have his home seized by eminent domain. And he refuses to sell his business. He says, I got my clause in my deed, I know my price. He goes back and forth with the city. There's another character, Hambone, who paints a fence for a ham. He paints the fence, he never gets his ham. He goes, give me my ham until he goes crazy and eventually dies. There's a happy ending. The happy ending is the owner, Memphis, actually gets $35,000, well beyond what he asked for. The point of it is, you got to know you have worth. But more importantly, you need to know your price to demand for it. That's what I'm saying. We got to have strategies to demand our price.
And our own neighborhoods have work.
Absolutely.
All right, and we are going to conclude there. Please join me in thanking this amazing panel.